Well, Mike is one of my most prestigious painters whose work I've ever sold. Mike is one of the most prestigious. I first came across him when a friend of mine from my university days, a lady, she phoned me up and she said, "I'm buying a painting." And I said, "Who are you? Who's it by?" She said, "Oh, it's by an Anglesey painter called Mike Knowles." Well, I'd heard of Mike Knowles, I'd read about him, and I said, "Oh yes," and she said, "He's coming round today to hang the picture for me." So that was that. And then when we'd gone off, I thought, I must have an investigation into Mike Knowles. So I looked him up, and he's very well written about everywhere. And I then was able to contact him. In fact, I think this lady gave him my phone number, or she gave me his address. And I went over to see him. And I was just staggered at the quality of the work that he had. Lots of them very large pieces, which I find difficult to sell because I always say that the one thing picture collectors are short of is wall space. And so to buy a very large painting means stripping a wall of all the smaller works. Well, they seem to much prefer to buy smaller works which they can shove in any small gap they've got. And what was interesting about Mike was his phenomenal career. I think it was in 1984 he was appointed head of fine art at the University of Liverpool, and then he subsequently went on to study at the Slade in London under the auspices of William Coldstream. And through William Coldstream he came across artists of the calibre of Michael Andrews, Jörn Uclo, Frank Auerbach, Kossoff, and he did in fact study under Auerbach and Kossoff, and you don't get much better than that. And his work is in many private collections, private and public collections. I've sold a lot of his work. The first several groups of paintings I got flew out of the place, and they've gone into some very important collections from amongst my customers. Oh, he's been a tremendous influence. He was a big friend of Peter Prendergast, though they were contemporaries, and he has influenced Sean Smith, who was a pupil of Mike's, and whenever an art with influence, I mean, Mike was influenced by Frank Auerbach to some extent and Kossoff, but of course the influence never became imitation. He never imitated the artists who taught him and who trained him, but he was influenced by their work, as is the case with most artists who, or probably all artists who train under someone, another prestigious painter. The quality of the work bears no relationship to the prices. The quality of the work is superb, and as is often the case, it's just good fortune when artists' prices rocket up. You know, like I remember Frank Auerbach, you know, there was a small portrait by him went up at Sotheby's this past year, and it was estimated at 300,000 to 400,000, and it went for 3.8 million. Now, if that same picture would have been sold 20 years ago, it wouldn't have fetched anything like that. It's the passage of time and the events that overtake the artist's life that result in these ludicrously high prices at public auction. Once the organisations become involved in collecting, and they don't care what they pay as long as they get what they want, and this is how it works. But I encourage people to buy Mike's work because I think there's a massive mileage still in Mike's work, because the quality is there. There's nothing one can say other than that the quality is there, the quality of the painting is there. And it's wonderful. Although I'm not an artist myself, I've learned to identify quality by dealing in so many, with the works of so many fine artists. And it looks easy, but you just try and have a go at it. as I once did, and failed disastrously. Yes, he's recently had a big exhibition at the Whitaker Gallery in locally, and he's had exhibitions at the Dean Clough Gallery at Halifax, at a big major one-man show there some years ago, and he's recently been exhibiting there again, and presumably there have been exhibitions about which I haven't heard, because I've known Mike probably about 4 or 5 years now, and I've known what's happened since I've known him, but I don't know what happened prior to that. Well, I think he's honed his skills like all artists do who regularly paint, and Mike is painting like all great painters. He paints all the time, and when I think about the work, the first lot of works I had, some of them were quite old, and because of course they were in his studio hanging on his wall, and I'd say, oh, can I have that one, Mike, can I have that one, Mike? Well, sometimes they were 10, 15, 20, 25 years old, the pictures, but now any pictures I get from Mike are recent works, and I never fail to be impressed by their quality. As a person, he's ridiculously modest. He never boasts. He never boasts about his background, and he's got an excellent sense of humour, and his grasp of the English language is amazing. Articles I've seen written by him are superb. He can master the right phrase, you know, and I've always been very impressed with Mike. Will Turner told me that it had actually happened to him. He'd gone to bed early, got up in the morning to paint, and this doorbell went, and this bloke, who apparently was the managing director of a company and had bought a lot of Will's work in the past, so he invited him in, and he kept him talking, he said, for 3.5 hours, and Will was furious because he wanted to get started on his painting. Anyway, he was telling Lowry this story, and Lowry said, well, I can beat that. He said, the same thing happened to me. He said, I was painting it late at night, went to bed to get up early in the morning to start painting again. He said, and I just set my easel up and my brushes and what have you, and there was a knock on the door, and he said, went to the door, and this man said, hello, Stephen. He said, listen, today is your day. I've organised us to have a nice meal out. I've organised this and I've organised that. And Laurie said, oh crumbs, how can I get out of this? I'm going to get back to... So he said, oh, he said, of all the days you could have picked, it could have been worse. He said, I'm going to London today to see my agent. Oh, he said, and so he said, any other day would have been perfect, but today I'm going to London to see my agent. Well, I'll tell you what, since I'd devoted the day for you anyway, he said, I'll give you a lift to the station. So Larry had to go in, he put his coat over his smock, picked up his little attaché case and came out and got into the car. And the man drove him down to Piccadilly in Manchester. And he said, well, thank you very much for the lift, it's been a great... No, he said, I'll come with you to the train. By now, Larry's beginning to panic because he wasn't going to London, he hadn't got a ticket. So he said they walked down, and as they reached, there was a ticket collector at the start of the platform, and he said, oh, I'll tell you what, I'll nip up and get a paper from the kiosk to read on the train. Oh, I'll come with... No, he said, don't, I'll be quicker if I'm on my own. So he said, you wait here and I'll be... And he said he went up the platform, went to the kiosk, looked back, and this man was talking to the ticket collector. He said, I climbed over the fence, got a taxi home, and I've never seen him from that day to this. He used to see Lowry on a fairly regular basis. They used to drink at a pub, but Lowry, he said Lowry was tight, to say the least. He said, if there were 5 of them, he said, each one would buy a round, but then Larry would say, good heavens, look at the time I've got to... And Larry would nip off then. But Larry didn't drink alcohol, so he'd only drink orange juice and things. But he'd never get into a round because he always nipped off just at the time as it came up for his turn. I remember Will telling me that. He said a lot about when he was trying to make it. He said he used to go to London with his pictures and he traipsed round half a dozen galleries, not interested. Nobody was interested in his work. He just couldn't get any interest whatsoever, and he was always very disappointed about that. In the same way that Lowry for long years didn't get any interest from London, because at that particular time in the 50s, 60s, 70s, the London galleries were London-based artists mainly, you know, and artists from up north weren't regarded as being of any interest. And so it took Will years before he was, and Wendy Levy at the gallery in Cheshire, she was the first really, you know, she began to have regular exhibitions there at the, I can't remember the name of the gallery in my brain. And then he sort of faded then, and he went into obscurity, which is when I came along. You know, he'd been many years in obscurity, and then I met him for the first time and began to sell his work. And one of the great painters that I ever had work from, who was a very close friend of Mike Knowles, was Nicholas Horsfield, who died when I think he was 87 when he died, and I got a lot of work from him over a period of 2 or 3 years, and they sold immediately. You know, he was a great painter, but he was fully trained artist. I remember he told me one story, Nicholas did, about, he was from quite a well-to-do family, and he went to a top public school, and in the summer his parents used to rent a villa in France, and they used to go there to stay. And he told me that they were staying at a place in France, and this man came in. He said, "Oh, your son's an artist, is he? There's George Braque is in the adjoining chateau. Would you like to meet him?" And Nicholas said, I think he said he was 19. He said, and I wasn't very knowledgeable at the time, you know, and he said, yeah, okay then. So they went there, and he was introduced to Braque, and Braque showed him around the studio, and he saw lots of drawings and preparatory works and things. And he said, but you know, Dave, he said, what's so annoying is that I wasn't aware of the importance of that meeting. He said it was only years afterwards when I thought I actually met Braque, and I hardly said a word to him. I just looked around his place, and then we came back. He said, I've always regretted that.